sound like a muted bell. Captain Liz stood on the quay with his coat buttoned to his throat, the squint in his face deeper than the fog. He took Jonah's ledger from his hands, as if he were an old acquaintance handing over a note. There was no admiration in his face, only the kind of practical concern that made Jonah's stomach feel as though someone had tightened a rope around it. "There's talk of a hold missed on the mariner's Pride," Captain Liz said. His voice was low, measured, the kind that did not lend itself to dramatic gesture. "A watchman forgot to signal. We nearly had a run-in with a shifting crate. You'll have heard." He waited as if the answer he needed might arrive unforced. Jonah had. He had heard how, the previous week, a man had left a check undone. A small negligence, but enough to make men curse and to force others to take midnight watches. He felt his own throat go dry. "I know who," he began, then stopped. It was not the sort of thing he could say with the ease he used in the market. Naming a person and a missing shadow meant bringing a past into the present, and Jonah had always treated such facts as delicate instruments. "We need to know what sort of thing you're doing, boy," Captain Liz said. "This town runs on lines and checks. If people are losing the things that make them cautious, then it's not just private sorrow. It's an open risk on the quay." He tapped the ledger with a knuckle. "You keep records. I don't want to have to go through the council with complaints and get them to put a stop to things by law. We are a small place. We need to be careful about who undermines what keeps the boats from breaking down in gale or drive. There's a habit here of making grief smaller. There's also the danger of making people smaller." He looked at Jonah with an intensity that made Jonah's hands feel inadequate. Jonah wanted, in that moment, to offer the language he had for making trade softened, not erased yet. The more he shaped his words, the smaller and less certain they felt. "I try," he said at last. "I try not to take what keeps people safe. I only offer a replacement that he could not finish without it sounding like an excuse." Captain Liz's eyes narrowed. "Tries aren't a comfort to a man who nearly loses his ship. We do not keep the sea by trying. We keep it with checks and with honesty. If what you do upsets that, then it's a different thing. You must find how to make sure a man will still look twice before he steps off a gangway." He spread his hands, a brief gesture like a man throwing a rope. "We all have reasons to want less pain. But there's a cost, lad. I run a dock. I can't have it that the easing of regret becomes the easing of caution. You'll need to show me, in plain steps, that your work won't endanger the boats." There was an unspoken ledger in his tone, one that was not Jonah's but which Jonah felt all the same. When Captain Liz walked away, Jonah stayed by the railing longer than was necessary, watching the boat's wake take the fog. He understood the captain's point with the unflinching clarity of someone who had watched his trades make people differently available to their days. To know that a man could forget an important check because a regret had been loosened to imagine a crate miscounted, a rope thrown poorly, was to see his work as more than a string of softened evenings. It made his ledger look like a map that had consequences beyond the household. That evening he took the ledger into old Tilda's shop. Tilda's room was a place of steady light in a town that mostly traded in shadows. On shelves were objects that seemed to carry their own histories: a thimble dented at the rim, a child's shoe preserved in a tin, jars of things that smelled faintly of rosemary and salt. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had spent a life holding other people's bodies and their small truths. Jonah sat opposite her, the ledger on his knees, and the two of them allowed the quiet to sit between them like a third person. "People come asking you for small things," Tilda said after some time, not looking at the ledger but at Jonah, at the way he folded his hands. Her voice had the old, steady cadence that could carry an accusation as easily as a blessing. "You make the small things softer. But you keep a record. The record is the thing that matters at the end. You mustn't let use become concealment. You hear me?" Jonah had heard her and felt, faintly, the shape of his own culpability. The ledger was not simply for his protection. It was a map of debts and alterations. "I try to be careful," he said. "I note what I change and why. I don't take what people need to remember to keep themselves safe." The phrase came out as if he had practiced it. Tilda tilted her head. Try is a good word for learning. But the ledger is small and human, and it can be wrong. Records do not make a thing moral, Jonna. They only tell us what we've done. You must also have a way to weigh the things you take. Some grief holds a person in the world. It shapes caution and tenderness both. You can't lighten everything without hearing what that lightness might leave behind. Jonna said nothing for a long while. Outside, a cart clopped past, and the sound seemed loud, like a puncture in the fog. He turned the ledger to the page where he had noted Thomas Reed's trade, and the neatness of his handwriting felt suddenly fragile. He had been proud of the trade and of the way it had smoothed a man's life. He had not considered enough whether what he took had been, in some small way, the very thing that had kept a younger mate safe. "How do you know?" he asked Tilda finally. "How do you know which sorrow you can make less and which must be kept?" Old Tilda's fingers closed around a rag, and she smoothed it as she listened. "You don't always know," she said. "Sometimes you refuse and someone begins to break because they've been carrying the sorrow badly. Sometimes you give and someone is less apt to learn from the thing that would have taught them. We live in a town that has never learned how to hold both truth and mercy at once. That is your trouble as much as mine. You must be more than careful, Jonna. You must have criteria." She gave him a look that was not unkind. "And you must be ready to be wrong." The readiness to be wrong felt like an H. Jonna thought of other trades he had done earlier in his work, a man who no longer woke in the night with dreams of a sinking boat. A widow who slept without the sudden, choking recall of a child's voice. The ledger held them all neat in columns, the scrawl of his own certainty beside each name. That night he walked the quay alone. Lamplight fell oblong on wet planks. He watched men who had been helped by him doing their tasks with a different economy of motion. One of them, a young sailor he had helped in exchange for a promise of steady work, hummed a song as he tightened a knot. It was a small consolation, and Jonna allowed himself to think it was worth something. But the thought did not last long. The memory of Captain Liss' words looped behind his eyes, making people smaller. The town's machinery might be greased by fewer sore throats and less nightly turning, but what was the cost if caution lapsed and small, local accidents became larger? Jonna had never wanted his work to be dangerous in this way, yet the evidence of small perils gathered like dark driftwood at the edge of the town's life. On the way home, he paused at a corner where the light made a shelf of shadow against a wall. A child ran by, chasing a gull. A woman called after him in a voice bright with reproach. Jonna put his hand on the ledger in his satchel and felt the brief, steady beat of his own pulse. He had told people what they sought to hear, that he would soften, not erase. But the language he used had margins and small print. He had no formal way to weigh one sorrow against another beyond the particular tenderness of his own judgment. He had not, he realized with a quiet dismay, thought through what a town that learned to outsource its burdens would look like when something went awry. That night, before he closed the shop's shutters, he wrote a note in the ledger's margin: reevaluate standards, confer with Tilda, speak with Liz. The writing was small and careful. It read, in the way only his ledger could read, like an attempt to make himself accountable to something larger than private need. He meant, he supposed, to take the first small steps toward a slightly more public ethic. He was far from certain how practical that would be. The town had a habit of preferring the quiet to the public in matters of sorrow. There was comfort in private repair. But the quay had shown him, in Captain Liss' blunt sentence, that private repair could ripple outward in ways the private did not always attend. He thought of the man on the Mariner's Pride who had failed to check the hold and felt a small, sharpened shame. The knowledge that his hands might have played some part in that fault sat inside him like a stone that would not be easily moved. As he locked up the jars, he checked each label again, lips moving slightly as if reading to himself. He liked the neatness of that act. It made him feel, for a little while, as if the world could be kept orderly by attention alone. He could imagine, uncomfortably, a town where every sorrow could be smoothed, every awkwardness tucked away in glass. He could also imagine, in the next instant, how strange such a town might be, the lines of memory that taught people not to leave a lamp burning, the quiet threads that encouraged someone to call a sister, the sharpness that made a man slow his pace on a rotten board. He had been giving people relief, and in so doing he had been changing them. On his way across the rope bridge he saw, for a moment, the outline of a stranger standing under the market awning. The man was tall and pale against the fog, wrapped in layered grays. He did not move as most did. He watched the quay as if cataloging it. Jonah could not say why the figure tugged at him with a small, unfamiliar unease. The man lifted a hand once, as if testing the air. Jonah turned his face toward the lane that led to old Tilda's and felt, without quite knowing why, a chill that was not entirely of the evening. It was easy in the hours after to tell himself that such impressions were the fog's work, or the mind's wandering as it catalogued small duties ahead. But the next morning the man was at the market again, and Jonah noticed, when he paused to tighten a cork, that the man lingered near another stall where men sold uncommon things. The man's hat had the dust of places not often seen in the town. When a buyer or a passerby glanced his way, the man gave a small, courteous nod and moved on. Jonah found his attention slipping to that man across the rest of the day, a small thread he could not quite follow. He told himself he was being anxious for no good reason. He had learned to be alert to people who took shadows. That awareness had the shape of a watchfulness that made him cold in the dark. He tried to set the thought aside. He had work to do, people to help, a ledger to make more honest. Yet the memory of Captain List's warning and old Tilda's measured counsel braided with the outline of the pale man into a new kind of concern. That usefulness required not only deft hands, but also a constant sense of how the tools of compassion might be misapplied. Jonah walked home under lantern light with a slow, careful step. He had no easy answer. He only had, as he had always had, his small ledger, the jars that ticked softly in their box, and the fog which both hid and revealed. Tonight the fog felt larger, as if it might hold more than it had in the past. He closed his door gently and placed the ledger on the table, writing in a hand that felt both steady and tentative. A single line, consult more, set criteria. Then he drew the shutters and sat for a while in the room's thin warmth, listening to the town move in its sleep like a distant breath. Outside, a bell sounded a ship preparing to loosen, a routine that would not be interrupted by the day's quiet debates. Jonah looked at the jars by lamplight, at the soft seals he had made with his hands, and thought of Captain List standing on the quay with his practical voice. He had been useful. He was used. There was a difference there he was only beginning to know. He closed the ledger and, for the first time in many evenings, left a page half open without the neat, finishing line. He slept fitfully, waking several times to imagine a board unsteady beneath a man's feet, to imagine a regret that had once taught someone to look before they stepped. At dawn he would go back to the quay, as he always did. He would attend to the small liturgies of his craft. He would speak to Captain List, measure the boundaries of what might be allowed and what might not. He would speak to Tilda and try, as she had instructed, to make a way to be wrong that did not break the town. He did not know yet whether the path he would choose would be enough. He only knew that the shape of his usefulness had changed, in ways that would not be undone by a single night's tidy remedies. The town's boats would still need men who remembered. The townspeople would still want evenings that were softer. Jonah's work, he realized, would have to learn to hold both demands at once. And as he closed the door behind him and felt the thin gasket of fog against his cheeks, he could not help but notice the pale man in gray at the market again, watching the quay with a look that suggested catalogue rather than compassion. Jonah walked toward the docks, the ledger in his satchel, and for the first time in a long while the fog seemed to be doing more than hiding. It was promising that something else, quieter and possibly more dangerous, might be moving beneath its surface. Jonah had grown used to the town offering itself in small, legible scraps. There was a grammar to the docks that he knew by the weather of it. How fog pooled against the warehouse doors like a slow apology. How ropes hummed when the tide had a mind to pull them. And how shadows, those quiet contradictors of light, leaned against people's ankles and told him things they would not say aloud. He understood the vocabulary of regret as if it were a trade's dialect, the heavy, dragging silhouette of unsaid goodbyes. The jagged notch where a promise had been broken. The softening smudge where a child's laugh used to fall and no longer did. He listened to these forms the way other boys might listen to a conversation, holding them in a practiced hand, measuring their weight against the ledger he kept folded into his coat. On market days, Jonah moved with the tide of stalls as much as with the tide of people. He liked the rhythm. There the merchants who shouted about salted herrings, the women who threaded their talk through the gaps of barrel staves, the sound of coins hitting a palm. It was a place where commerce kept its elbows, where everyone could see them. You could read a man's face across a scale and guess at whether his trade had gone fair. It suited Jonah because his own exchanges were made precise by habit, a shadow unloosed in the quiet, a softened replacement slid into place like a patch, and his notes time, person, shape, what was asked to be forgotten written down in the neat, spare script that made his ledger look more like a map than a record. The day the pale man in gray appeared, Jonah had been counting in his head. There was a pattern to the count. 2 soft trades in the morning, a jar sealed at noon, a walk to old Tilda's to ask after a certain color of thread she used to wrap her bottles. He had his pockets full of small things, a cork, a scrap of wax, a coin that might sit quietly between pages of his ledger when he needed to remember that not everything was barter. The market was full of its usual noises, but there was a new note. Something like the sound a door hinge makes when you close it upon a room where people are meant to be kept neat. He first saw the man under an arch by the fish stalls. Jonah's eyes, trained to the edges and to the way shadows gather, found him in the spaces where light had been careful. He wore gray that seemed to be the exact color of damp paper left too long on a window's layers, like leaves of a book, neat and not showy. He was not old in the way some of the harbormen were old. He moved with a sort of preserved reserve. When he leaned to speak with the broad-shouldered woman who traded in dusted odds and shadow bits, Jonah noticed the hands first. They were long and precise, with the thoughtful tremor of someone who handled small things daily. The man tapped a token against a leather cover as if following the administrative cadence of a ledger, motion, pause, notation. Jonah had met many collectors in the market. There were those who liked the bright, apologetic shadows, the ones people desired to lose quickly, the edges of shame sanded down until they were more useful. There were others who liked the sweet weight of recent regret, the kind that became serviceable, a soldier's hesitation on a dock, a widow's nighttime recall that kept her from sleep but did not unmake her. This man, however, did not seem interested in the newly made or the soft. He wanted what was older. Jonah saw that in how he handled a small, cloth-wrapped thing the woman unrolled for him. He held it as if one might handle a book of fragile notes, tilting it just so, reading the tag as if reading a title. Their transaction made no show. There was a murmured price, the clink of a small metal disc from his pocket, a swift exchange of hands, and the man folded the cloth back and tucked the object away close to his chest. He said a single word of thanks in a voice that slid like a damp ribbon into the market din, and then he was gone, walking past the rope bridge as if he belonged to the fog rather than to the sun. Jonah's chest had a small, immediate tug then, the familiar alarm that came before thought fully formed. It was not fear. He had practice with fear. It was the feeling of a precise imbalance. The knowledge that someone somewhere had paid for a thing not because they wanted to make life easier, but because they wished to keep a ledger of what had been. He did not know the man's name at that instant. He would learn it the following week. And the sound of it would be as flat and as final as a stamp, but he knew the reluctance in the other's fingers. It said, in its own careful way, that what he collected was not to be ameliorated but to be kept. Old Tilda saw the expression before Jonah could cloak it for himself. She had stood in her doorway, as she always did, with a kettle steaming on the sill and several of her small jars catching the light like a congregation. When Jonah moved toward her, he found her hands busy with a piece of yellowed cloth and her face grave in the way it was when she had delivered bad weather to a doorstep. "You saw him," she said without preface. It was a statement, not a question. Old Tilda's voice often folded the unsaid into speech so cleanly that Jonah sometimes felt he was being read like the inside of a jar. "He bought something from Maris," Jonah answered, because he preferred the economy of facts to the danger of impressions. Old Tilda set the cloth down slowly. The kettle hissed like a slow-lipped warning. "That one," she said, "has a ledger too. But he keeps it for himself." Jonah watched her as if she might unfold the map of what that meant. Old Tilda did not have to. He could see it now, the man's posture that read like a person who catalogued rather than cured, the way his hands preserved rather than eased. The town's trade in shadows had long sat between two economies, one of mercy, which Jonah tended with a practiced gentleness, and one of convenience, which the harbor council sometimes winked at when a man needed to go to sea with less worry in his chest. This man, however, seemed to introduce a third economy, one of scholarship, of order. "He thinks he can keep sorrow safe," Old Tilda said then, in the low voice she used for factual things that were also warnings. "As if the sorting of it will stop it from growing." "Who is he?" Jonah asked. It felt oddly private to ask. The question made his fingers itch at his own ledger, where names and shapes had to be kept honest. Old Tilda pursed her lips. "There are men in this town who mend nets and men who keep books. There are men who do both. The one you saw wears his book as a coat." She tapped the sill to emphasize the point. "His name is Elias Venn." The name settled into Jonah the way certain old notes do unremarked until the chord is struck. He had not heard it before, and any of the exchanges had written down. He imagined, for reasons he could not name, a room full of labeled jars and paper tabs, a place where the past was given a neat tag and kept from the mess of living. It was a small image, and it troubled him more than it ought to have. Jonah's work had always been concerned with the immediate shape of regret, not with anthologizing it. To keep sorrow as if it were a tax to be recorded was, to Jonah's ear, a strain too tidy. He watched for a few days. Habit was useful in this. You saw what came again if you learned to read the intervals. Elias did not visit daily, but when he came he moved like a man making rounds. He spoke little. In the pockets of his coats he had small lead tokens, stamped with his own simplistic device, a circle with a thin line through the middle, things he passed without ostentation. Jonah traced how Elias approached his purchases with a kind of institutional calm. There was no hawking, no stirring of pity. There was instead a patient curiosity that read tags and dates like scripture. Jonah tried to understand the man's interest in older shadows, not by imagining the other's motives. Jonah had learned over years that motives were hazardous to guess, but by observing what Elias treated as important. At a stall where Jonah once bought tiny bottles of salt for Old Tilda, he saw Elias lean close to a jar whose tag read, "The evening when El forgot the name of the tide." Elias' fingers paused over the paper with a respect that made Jonah think of the way some people bowed to portraits in shops. He did not ask for a softened version. He bid a price in a small, mechanical voice, sealed the jar with his hand as if saying a benediction, and tucked it away with the same care a clerk might show to a lost document. There were conversations about Elias, of course. Rumor straightened itself around him the way tides carved sand. Some said he was a scholar, others a hoarder, others a man who had once lost his family and had taken to preserving other people's longings to keep himself from sinking further into his own. Jonah, who preferred not to live much in narrative, listened and took only the facts. Elias acquired older, less softened shadows. He paid well. He was accompanied, sometimes by a tidy-seeming clerk. There were no dramatic stories about him. Those who spoke of him did so as if they were reciting a civic ledger. Jonah's unease settled into a practical inquiry. If Elias was collecting these things, what did he do with them? Old Tilda suggested what she always suggested in moments of moral anxiety, that some things should not be made convenient. "We patch the hurt so people can stand straight," she told him one evening, folding her cloth like one more thing kept neat. But there is a difference between mending and reweaving. Jonah tried to imagine the difference. He imagined the harbor's cloths frayed at the edges and people whose silhouettes had been made serviceable. He imagined his own ledger and the lines had drawn between one kind of forgetting and another. He found himself worrying about the prescriptive quality of Elias, collecting the temptation to know how a town should feel, to file pain into boxes and keep it from ever changing. He had always thought of his work as private, remedial, a series of small mercies. Seeing someone who wanted to keep the mercy's object inert felt, to him, like encountering a hand that would bind the river. Once, when the market was thin and the light had the pallor of a bruise, Jonah followed Elias a short distance. He told himself he was being careful, and that his curiosity was a sound guide, not an indulgence. He kept to the edges and watched the man cross the quay, his coat absorbing the fog as if it were absorbent cloth. Elias Podestall Jonah knew as Maris. She sold things in envelopes and in slices, the shells of favors, a child's first day ribbon, a scrap of letter with 3 inked words still legible. Maris liked to bundle her wares in paper and tie them with twine. She moved in a practical gentleness that matched Jonah's own. She unwrapped a small vial for Elias to see. It had a label made of rough paper and a short note written in a hand that shook with age, the hour the boy left for the sea, and did not return. Elias turned the vial between his fingers as if testing its balance. He did not smile. He placed the small coin on the table with a precise motion. His voice was that careful thing again. And Jonah could not tell whether the voice belonged to a man who pitied the bottle's owner, or to someone who admired the object itself as an exemplar. "Where will you keep it?" Jonah allowed himself to ask when the man turned to leave. The question fell with an awkwardness Jonah later realized came from the suddenness with which his own privacy felt exposed. Elias' eyes met Jonah's for a long, brief moment. They were a dull, steady gray. "Where all of these are kept," he said simply. "Where they are made plain." There was something less like an answer than a placement of fact. Jonah felt oddly out of his depth at the exchange, as if he had been invited to look into a room whose walls had been painted by someone who preferred cold colors. He wanted to ask how the man thought making things plain had any mercy in it. He wanted also to say nothing at all and to hold on to the map his ledger made of where had touched people's lives. He did neither. Instead, he watched Elias fold the vial into cloth, pay Maris, and return to the fog. The street seemed quieter after the man left, the market's voices retreating into themselves like gulls sucked beneath a breeze. Jonah found himself with the ledger in his hand, comforting himself with the small economies of notation. He wrote in the margins that evening, a man in gray Elias Venn catalogues older shadows. Paid Maris for a vial with the tag, boy left for sea. He pressed the page closed and felt, for the first time in a while, that his ledger was not solely a record but a boundary. The thought made his chest ache in a way he did not expect. He had always thought the ledger a refuge for his own anxieties, a way to keep the commerce of loss legible, to make certain that a bargain done for a neighbor did not become a bargain that unmade someone. But as Elias' shadow moved across the town's periphery, Jonah felt the ledger's pages as a fragile thing between two powers, the small mercies he offered and a larger appetite for preservation that might freeze those mercies into artifacts. He went to old Tilda's the next day to ask about the ethics of collection, not because he would learn anything she did not already know, but because he liked the way her language made complicated things less combustive. She brewed tea as if to make an argument palatable, and then leaned back to read his face, as if she could read pages and people in the same way. "What do you think he's doing truly?" Jonah asked. keeping his voice light because he had always been inclined to use humor as a salve when things felt raw. Old Tilda looked at him with the steady gaze that had once guided 1,000 deliveries. A man like that is afraid of losing